As always, I want to start by thanking Blue Sky Gallery. Amanda and Zemi and Molly are a fantastic team to get to work with. If you are new, welcome. I will remind everybody that we record these sessions, so please know that you are being recorded and they are available for viewing on Blue Sky's YouTube channel thereafter. This is very interactive. I'm not doing a talk, I'm facilitating a discussion. And that means that you can either raise your hands using the exciting raise hands feature, which at the probably bottom of your Zoom screen, there's something that says reactions. And if you click on that, you can see a little raise hand and you should raise your hand. Look, I just did it. Isn't that cool? And now I'm going to lower my hand. Or you can put your comments in the chat either way. Amanda is fantastic at helping me keep an eye on those. If you just raise your physical hand, you may fall off the screen once I start to share screens. So that becomes a less effective way to communicate your desire to contribute. We at Blue Sky humbly acknowledge that our programming is held on the traditional lands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Malala, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Wimal and Willamette rivers, which we call the Columbia and Willamette rivers today. We also acknowledge that in this online format, you may be participating from other areas, and we invite you to consider your own land acknowledgement that reflects your location. We also acknowledge that the very technology we rely on for these online programs is inequitably distributed and not equally accessible, which creates new virtual displacements and exclusions. We always call attention to the need for action now and in the future to address these disparities. And again, I say this in some form at the beginning of all of these programs, but the reason we do these online salons is really, they started in the gallery with the idea that if you come in and you look at the work in the gallery, you might talk about it with whoever you came in with, but wouldn't it be nice if we actually had a way to facilitate bigger community discussions, both around the, I was going to say photographs, but not always photographs that hang at Blue Sky. And often I pair them with poems, both in the gallery and online. When we went into the virtual mode, we thought this would be a great way to think about new ways to create community online. I always say, I'll ask questions for you guys to answer. These are not questions for which there is a right answer. They are about what your observations are. And the goal of these conversations is for us to kind of build our understanding collectively. So if there's a program I lead where I leave not having learned anything, I would think it was a pretty unsuccessful program. It hasn't happened yet with Blue Sky. So I look forward to us all learning from each other tonight. Also, I would just like to note that it is National Poetry Month. And even though I almost always have poetry, I actually don't tonight. So that's my, I don't know, recalcitrance, but there will be poems again in future sessions. And I guess I will just jump in and start sharing slides. And as I put up the first slide, I'm going to say, when I show this, think about your very first impression of the first image that I'm going to show. Nope, that didn't do it. Like a month is just enough time to forget how to do that every time. I think yeah, your very first impression. And I'll ask Amanda to let me know if anybody, when the first person either raises their hand or starts commenting in the chat. Steve has said, Earth upside down, and it looks like Alan has a hand raised. Amanda, does Alan unmute himself or do you have all the power?
I asked him to unmute.
I just paraphrase that by saying the world upside down.
Okay, so we're hearing a lot of upside downness. Michael has commented in the chat, so much water. And Yu Yang says sort of similar thing. The majority of the land area feels really compressed. Nicole says, I don't know if I should be saying Nicole or Nicole Jean.
Nicole's fine.
Okay. Nicole says, Abstract and representation at the same time. Beautiful. So it's really interesting that we assume that this is upside down, right? We only think this is upside down because we have spent our whole lives seeing the same image right side up. Molly's checking to see if it looks the same right side up. And yet we just accept that there is a right side up in this world and that this is not the way that we're used to seeing it. And in fact, that idea that it is both abstract and representational, I think, fits with that because we read it as representational when it looks the way that we're used to. And the fact that the amount of water surprises us also tells us something about what is prioritized in most of the images that we have of the Earth. So this is very much a view, our usual view is very much a view that comes out of the global north on top, but it's not just that the global north is on top. We also have this notion of progress that goes from east to west. This is a pretty well-known, yeah?
Before we move on, Molly, I think Molly Newgard had wanted to chime in on the first image.
Oh, sorry, no, I was just gonna reiterate what many people were saying. It seems like there's a bit of a duality going on, like a sense of recognition of what we're looking at, but also the abstract, the representational, the abstract, something familiar that we want to try and identify. But I think the beauty of it is it is a little bit elusive, even if it's recognizable. That's all.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Amanda, for keeping me honest. So I started to move on excitedly. We'll come back to inversions. That this is a sort of famous painting that, in addition to putting the global north on top, puts progress as a move from east to west. It's a notion of progress that is based not only on repeated displacements of Native people, but also on a belief that privileges what I would call an extractive model of farming, of ranching, of exploiting natural resources. You can see all of that happening here. Erasing and those practices erase and eradicate indigenous stewardship practices that predated European arrivals, right? It's not like the continent was empty and waiting for somebody to farm it. And it also has an implicit yet inaccurate equation of technology with progress and with positive outcomes, right? So telegraph wire is being strewn across the country. We see the railroad in the background, other forms of farming technology, all part of American progress circa 1872. I will say that tonight we will also be, I think, in some ways, turning many of the ideas implicit in this painting upside down. So I want to come back to thinking about what we're used to seeing, or the way that we're used to thinking about the natural space of this country. And I guess my first set of questions before we even get to the photographs is, when did you first have a sense of the West, of what the West was or meant or stood for? And where did your sense of the West come from?
Chuck Barnes, what do you think?
Hey, I grew up in Eastern Canada, and so my image of the West was of the American West, and it was from TV entirely. Two things: the Lone Ranger, the old show, and the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote cartoons. Those were my two sort of formative experiences of the American West.
Why didn't you have a sense of the Canadian West?
There was a view of the Canadian West. In fact, there was a TV show in the 1970s called The Beachcombers about two guys who salvaged logs. And although that was a very compelling show, which was explicitly about the Canadian West, it was about the coastal West. The categories of West to me did not mean that. They were all about the cowboys and about the desert.
Right. So, and it's interesting because as Chuck was speaking, Pat and Michael were posting in the chat, and Pat said TV, and Michael said movie westerns. So I think combine that with Chuck to say, and American cultural imperialism brings those things to lots of places. Yehuda, what were you going to say?
Yeah, it's funny. My first image that I recall is also a cartoon of, I think, Bugs Bunny driving north through California, and he gets to the Oregon border and it's raining. So he takes the California sign and puts it on the front of his car and continues on with nothing but sunshine. The other thing is that my aunt was much younger than my father. And when she got married, she and her husband moved west. And the sentiment in our family, she moved to LA, the sentiment in my family was that she had abandoned the family. And even though I was probably very young, I picked up something about that, because when I was 18, I moved west and I've never gone back, or at least not for more than a few weeks.
So having seen your aunt embody rejection of the family, you did the same. I think it's also interesting. I mean, so those two examples from Chuck and Yehuda about the way that even cartoons are enforcing these ideas, and that part of Wile E. Coyote is, and Roadrunner is the technology available, the commercialized technology through the Acme, whatever he's trying to use to destroy the Roadrunner. And then that Bugs Bunny has a car. And then if you just categorize things correctly, if I label this California, I can force nature to obey what I want it to obey. Kathy wrote Laura Ingalls Wilder books in the chat. And Kathy, can I put you on the spot just to sort of say what the concept of the West is in those books for folks who have not read them?
I'll do an ask to unmute, but she might have stepped away. And in the meantime,
There we go. No, it's because I had the whole gallery up and I couldn't find myself. Well, I lived in the Midwest. I lived in Colorado, but I read the Laura Ingalls Wilder books, which follows a family with, I guess you would say, a restless dad. And so it starts in a little cabin in the woods, I don't know, Vermont or someplace like that. And they gradually move west more than once. It seems to me they're in some place that was probably, there's 7 stories. I read them in elementary school. I cried when they were over. And they spent some time where there were a lot of trees up north. I think they ended up in the little house on the prairie, where there was some sort of, I think in retrospect, probably some pretty creepy ideas about Native peoples, even though I think I would like to reread some of that, because Wilder may have been hinting at something more enlightened, but at least she recognized what wasn't enlightened. And I think the little house on the prairie is where it stopped. I didn't make it to the coast, nor did the family, I think.
So I didn't know that they started not on the prairie, because I was never really a watcher of the TV show, but that's the only way I know it. I will say that people I know who grew up loving those books have said revisiting them as an adult, you find that they are very problematic in just the way that even without rereading them, you've begun to suspect. Does Marvin have a hand up?
Well, yeah, I was trying to put my hand up earlier, but I wasn't doing it right, apparently, because it didn't get up. Several things. I first got my idea of the West, I think, from comic books, but also primarily from a project that I had maybe in 4th grade, where we created a Indian village, a Midwest. I'm from Chicago, so we're talking about the Plains Indians. And made little teepees and whatever cultural artifacts we had. I don't remember what it was, but I was going to go back to looking at the map. Consider how this would look. This would look if this country was settled by people from Africa. This would look normal. because they're at the top of their world, south of the equator. And this is an expression of Western culture, as you said. And it's also an expression of the concept of the Western movement of civilization, because Europe and this country are basically oriented east-west. And also the fact that when the Spaniards came here, they came to extract. Their goal was to take out gold and silver and tin, particularly. And so they conscribed the natives as workers and slaves. The Westerns, the Northern Europeans came here to farm. Totally different attitude toward the land and the people in it. And so, because in order to farm, they had to push the people off. And that's a whole string of things I was thinking as I was futilely trying to figure out a way to say, hey, me.
Right.
So I'm the little kid in the back of the room raising his hand. Okay. Anyway, that's approximately what I kept trying to say.
Sure. Thank you. And I also wanted to call out that Zemi in the chat has said, having grown up in Oregon, there's history and mythology of the Oregon Trail that's a big part of public school education, lots of field trips, pioneer days. So we also all have this relationship that I think people have been noting, predicated on where we live. I will say before we leave this map that, of course, in space, there is no up and down, right? It's not like this map is an upside down view of Earth. Earth does not have any way that orients up and down. We just believe that it has one of those things because map makers predominantly from the global north created a system of maps. But I believe we came here to talk about photographs. So let's, with our thoughts about the West in mind, how does this photograph confirm or comment on the way that dominant American culture imagines the West, the kind of things we've been talking about, and how might it be contesting that ways of imagining the West?
Sarah, Gru, start us off.
Oh, Sarah, you're still muted.
Oh, yeah, there I am. Yeah, well, obviously the image is, sort of the Grand Canyon, that expanse of never-ending space of the West, of the Western Badlands sort of thing, desert. But and that's how it fits in with everything we've been talking about. But what's interesting is that the person standing there is pretty clearly an African American, and so that right there is a denial of what we normally see in our Western, European focused, centered way of looking at things.
Okay, so Sarah's taken us right to this interesting question. And I want to push a little bit on this, because if you know Johnnie Chapman's bio, you know that he's African American. Oh, but Pat has said in the chat, he's Black. Thank you, Pat, because I want to ask whether that's actually something that is evident in the photo or not. Is that information that we're taking and looking at the photo with? Or it seems like Pat is saying, yeah, I would not necessarily have known that.
Well, that's interesting to me because I knew it right away.
How?
By his hair.
And I realize that I'm putting us in dangerous territory. I write about African-American history a lot and spend a lot of time critiquing the way that people are always trying to read bodies. So I realize that I'm taking us into troubling territory to ask us to read bodies and try and impose ideas about race on them. But I think this is a really interesting question because it's who can tell and who can't tell. And I've now lost track Amanda, of who's waiting in what order. So can you give us like, who are the next 3 people up?
Yes, definitely. I was sorry, I almost cut you off there to say this, but Chuck and then Yu Young and then Ralph Wells would like to share thoughts with us.
Hand up signal.
I would say it's even hard to tell what the, when I see this kind of profile, to me, I'm trained as an architect, and this to me looks like a scale figure, right? It looks like here's a landscape and here's a scale figure to show you how big a human is in this. And to me, it's sort of gendered male just because of the kind of profile of the body, but I have no real evidence of that. This really is almost like a silhouette of absence, even, because since it's also black, the person is almost the blackest thing in. There's a couple pieces of shadow or shade. It's like there's the person is where everything else isn't, I guess is what I would say.
So when you say black, you don't mean black in the sense of like somebody descended from Africa. You mean like a
I don't mean melanin.
Pale.
Yeah, I mean just like the absence of light.
Right. Like it's Pat said, it's like the figure is a hole in the picture, and I want us to think about what that means, that's the picture that's being constructed. But I know that I have to wait until after, I think Yu Yang and Ralph were next.
Yeah, I think I agree with what Chuck has said, and having I not known the photographer personally, I would say the assumption of the blackness is given away by the silhouette, the lack of the lack of the silhouette of the figure, and also the general like the blackness of this figure. I think in my opinion, the blackness it's suggested by this silhouette and by this figure.
Right, and that it would look very different if this were a color photograph as opposed to black and white. That the richness. Ralph, you are next.
Yeah, I think this is the first of a number of photos in the series, and as an introductory photo, I don't think it has enough information to tell you the ethnicity or the color of the person, but it is an unusual image, silhouette image, because it looks like, what I can see is that it's an image of someone wearing a sports coat of some sort. And it's an odd image. For me, it's an odd image to see on a promontory overlooking the Grand Canyon. What is this person doing there, standing there in a sports coat looking over the Grand Canyon? So I think it's disorienting visually without really needing to know what the color of the person is. Just this by itself is a strange image. And then you find out that the imagery is of a different sort as well. But I think this is more introductory than comprehensive as an image. Anyway,
Yeah.
That's all I have to say.
Yeah, no, I think that you're right, that there's an out of placeness, and this, Michael had also put that in the chat about the clothing, which is maybe slightly more readable, even on a silhouette. It emphasizes this idea of being out of place. And Molly Newgard had also put in the chat, human in nature, kind of a human's intervention or human relationship to nature. And I think that we want to think about what that tells us or says. Is that confirming or challenging the notion of the West? And Daryl, it seems like, has been struggling to raise his hand. So I'm just going to call on Daryl so that Daryl can speak up.
Daryl,
Okay.
and then Kristen Blake is after this.
Yeah, I was working on still trying to find that link in participants. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I came to this, and I'm sorry I was late. I thought it was at 6, not 5. But I came to this because of my interest in rephotography. And having taught photo history for many years, I'm interested in the West and the images. My first reference to this is the sense of emptiness and placing figures into that context, which was a photographic device that many of the survey photographers used, but it also was somewhat ammunition supplied as a justification for moving west, and that the indigenous peoples really didn't use the land. It was, as I think Martha Sandweiss referred to, as the big empty. I don't know if it's Martha Sandweiss or Barbara McCandless from the Emmon Carter, but there's a couple of books about this type of photography. And there's this immense sense of space and then this singular figure, but it's certainly more prominent here. And I think between the silhouette, which, sorry, I'm just going to have to make other references, reminds me of Kara Walker's work, places someone who is really out of place in this environment. And in the fact that they're African-American adds another layer. So, I mean, I think it's borrowing from certain devices from history, as well as from photo history or photo art history. And it's made a compelling image, but it's simplistic. And I think that other images, and I haven't seen other images to support this, would need to dig a little bit deeper and kind of make some more either references or footnotes to really more effectively make this about a dialogue about who belongs in these landscapes and who doesn't. And of course, no one doesn't, but it's kind of not the point of the photograph, I think.
Sure.
Yeah,
So
that's what I had to say.
I'm going to recap a few things. And if anybody's having trouble with the raise hand feature, just type raise hand in the chat and Amanda and I will keep track of that. We don't need to make the technology a barrier at all. You know, Kara Walker's work with silhouettes is also always referencing earlier silhouette art from the late 18th and 19th century. And in fact, somebody put in the chat, yes, if it weren't for the shadow, it would look like this is just a plain paper cutout, right? So I think that is part of what's going on. I also like that Daryl said, you know, Chuck said, this looks like an architectural figure. I'm trained as an architect and this looks like an architectural figure. And Daryl said, well, actually, there's a photographic tradition about surveying that also has that kind of figure. And then Brianna had said in the chat, we also are used to seeing lots of pictures. They're now selfies, but before that, they were just, you know, one person took the picture or somebody ran into the picture on the self-timer of people standing in front of the beautiful landscapes of the American West, but they're always facing the camera. So the same way that the suit jacket makes us feel like there's something slightly out of place, this is not the person who's posed there for us to look at.
Looks like Kristen Blalik is next.
Oh, right, I forgot that. Kristen, please.
Hi. As I've looked at this photograph and thought about it, it has a whole bunch of different stories behind it for me. And but because the selection, I guess it's at the Grand Canyon, but it's all this bare rock.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of like the desolation of the West rather than majestic snow-capped mountains and rivers and forests. And then this figure of a person dressed, who looks like they're dressed in contemporary clothing. It's like, to me, it's about what we've done to the West in our living there, in our conquering it. And then there's also the element of, for the original settlers, it was a very terrifying place and a huge journey to get there, and all full of uncertainty and strangeness. Nobody had seen places like this before, I think. Anyway, those are impressions that I have from it.
Right. And there's a bit of a cheat here because this is a black and white photo. And if you've been in the Grand Canyon, which I have had the pleasure of doing, it's incredibly vibrant and you have a sense of the aliveness. And I think it's also true, the original settlers were native to this area and it wasn't that kind of challenging landscape for them. It was a place that they called home.
But
and
that's not a native person that silhouette.
Right, but that is again a product of the way that we've learned to experience the West through a dominant white culture tradition. And this is what Daryl was saying before, that this space wasn't empty. There were people, there were plants, there was flora and fauna, and it was being actively managed by the people who lived here, but not in a way that white culture chose to see and recognize and value. I'm gonna pop us to the next photo now. I love this juxtaposition. I just wanted to do that one more time. So how is this also a photograph of the West? And is this West the same as the West in the Chapman photo that we were just looking at?
I'll volunteer. I think that there's a lot of similarities simply because I feel like this is an immigrant, someone who might have been traveling west for the promises that were alluded to in everything from newspapers to dime novels or nickel novels, whatever they cost. That would have drawn people there, but that this sort of innocence and then this incredibly desolate landscape that wouldn't be hostile to either the child or the cat. So, you know, it's that kind of mashup of a person making the photograph, because there's a photographer here who saw this moment and captured it, but then the context of where they were, what they were doing, why they were there. The fact that this is from 1911, it's still a hostile time for settling out west. I mean, I don't think Arizona was really quite settled around this, and the Grand Canyon, and I don't know where this actually was not really a place that anything other than tourists and a few people actually lived. It's just not hospitable territory until you've got water and other sort of things that you need to sustain life. But the traveling across the West was fraught with all sorts of peril and harshness. Yet this photograph seems to sort of underlie that, which, you know, if it was to be used as an advertisement today, would suggest that, hey, it's not that big of a deal, which really isn't true. So I don't know what the intent of the original photographer was, but in this sort of like, you know, post-historical, you know, context, it's quite poignant.
So, and I want to thank you. I'm going to call out, I see that Molly Newgard has a hand up, but I want to call out some of the things that have appeared in the chat. Because the first comment, I think, was Pat saying, not such a majestic view, more down to earth, literally, but Yehuda says, but still wide open spaces. Brianna said, I just noticed the shadows in this one. Is that the photographer, perhaps, right? So there's a lone figure here. Well, I guess two, if you count the cat as a separate figure. There are these two beings here, but maybe an implication of one or more other people there. Kathy has said, a wonderful play of lights and darks, and maybe we can come back to that. Lots of speculation about what's going on the side. Molly, what's on your mind?
Well, it's great to contrast these two. I see like more specificity in this and see it more as a portrait. I mean, I know the other image was entitled Self-Portrait, but I think there's a greater and grander, perhaps sweeping statement in Johnnie Chapman's work, and this is an intimate kind of portrait or a capturing of a moment, almost trying to kind of capture and kind of solidify this moment in time, or the relationship between photographer and subject matter.
So I'm going to push you. I don't disagree, but this person also is not facing the camera. So how is this? How does she make this feel more like a portrait?
I think there's more of a casual nature to it. And one that kind of, I think it introduces like a moment in time, almost as if this subject is turning. You know that cat's not going to be on that head for very long, right? So it's just like having the camera ready to capture that. Whereas I think there's a different kind of intention in Johnnie Chapman's self-portrait. So a portrait can be about the back, right? It can be a self-portrait, a portrait of a photographer taking one of someone else, and but I see this more as a a portrait as a moment in time.
Right, and then I think that the cat, you're right, is doing tremendous work in this photograph because it is part of, somebody had said, I think Brianna said it feels gentler than the previous photo. It's sweet. The cat is doing that. We know that that cat is going to be there, whereas that silhouetted figure in front of the expanse of the Grand Canyon with no other sign of human felt a little time immemorial. I've been working on a history project in which they keep using the phrase time immemorial, whereas this is moment captured. And that, as Steve is pointing out, we actually have more information, although this person is not facing the camera, we have more information. A child, we can see more specifically some of the features as well as the details of the clothing. I feel like Marvin raised a hand in the chat and then Ralph is coming after Marvin. Is that right,
And
Amanda?
then I think it looks like maybe also Daryl would like to.
Okay.
So am I on? I just keep focusing on the way that the shadow bisects the figure. And the shadow also is parallel with, almost covers this other shadow, which is in front of the figure, which you see, it looks like that a whole picture is cut at an angle across there. And there's a lot more than some people going on. There's something in the background that's doing this, but what it does is it creates a frame for the top half of the figure and the hat and the cat. I don't know what that means, but it stands out to me that he's saying, well, here's what I want you to look at, or she is, what I want you to look at. And I put a frame around it.
And I also find really interesting the way, do you guys see my cursor when I put it over there? Is that showing up? The shadow on the body kind of follows, there's a line in the landscape to the left of the figure and then another line in the landscape to the right of the figure. And it gets weirdly connected by the shadow that's on the shirt. That can't have been intentional and planned, but I think it sort of works with what you're talking about. Was Ralph next?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. You know, just a little comment on that, whether it's intentional or planned or not, is that it ends up, once it's in there, to me, it ends up being intentional and planned. It's going to take it upon yourself to give yourself a good sense of vision because it was right there for you. Anyway, talking about this as portraits, I think that it doesn't have to be, and especially Lois, this is the way that you phrased it, I thought, was that what is the comparisons between these two?
I'm losing you, Ralph. Is that true for everybody else?
Yeah.
And for me, it is. It's not necessarily a sequence of other photos or a portrait of being, or a portrait of possibility, looking out towards a landscape, both a poetic and metaphorical and real, the landscape, and facing it.
Oh, this is exceptionally frustrating because Ralph keeps kind of cutting in and out and saying wonderful things for the phrases that I can hear. Ralph, if you're able to hear me, it might help if you turned your video off, and I think it would give your bandwidth more. Or did we lose Ralph entirely?
Oops.
Why don't we go to Daryl was waiting next, and then if Ralph reappears.
I don't know. Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Anyway, I was saying that it's a portrait. It could be a portrait of a moment, a portrait of looking, or a portrait of being, not necessarily of a person, but of a moment. If you're like that kind of portrait, I think it is more in. I see it evocative of that sort of portrait of a moment where you are looking towards your future or something. I just find it's more compelling as that kind of portrait for me, as opposed to a portrait of a particular person in a particular situation. So
yeah, I want to call out something that I think you were saying earlier, and it may have gotten lost partway, sorry, is that like this person is clearly looking out, but we can't tell at all where. Whereas this person is looking out and you can see much more foreground as well as background. and maybe even a slight tilt of the head, which may have more to do with how I balance a cat on my head than actually what I'm looking at. But it gives us more information about where they're looking. Daryl, you've been very patient. You're up.
Yeah, I know that people do travel with cats, but it's not normal.
Not for the cats.
having moved from Michigan to Oregon last summer with 5 cats, it's intentional, but this is a move. This is everything lock, stock, and barrel heading someplace. The cat, it wasn't John, so it wasn't tourism. This is a more final thing. And I think what Ralph said, that this is really a looking future. It's true. I mean, I can't imagine how bizarre the landscape, or at least strange, different to the child this has to have been from wherever they came from. But the intimacy, the relationship with the cat is really familial. They have a comfortable relationship. The cat doesn't look stressed at the moment. So this is really a moment in many families' transitions to someplace, and it really captures that essence of being in transition, and in a big way. But it's simplistic in every other way, formally and everything else. And I just like to say about the composition, that line that runs through it. I mean, those sort of fortuitous compositional things, either sort of like they just happen because that's the way our eyes tend to focus and try to frame things compositionally, but it really does work well. And it really makes 2 photographs, the upper left, the lower right. They're separate and combined into one. So that kind of composition juxtaposition is really sweet.
Yeah, and I will say we have to be careful. Thank you. We have to be careful about imposing narrative. I mean, for all we know, Bert Oldman was actually born in this place. We don't know how long this family has been here.
Right.
I want to call out some of the things folks have been saying in the chat. Brianna said, the Chapman photo is a single figure alone in space. It feels vaster and maybe lonelier. And that made me think about, if we are reading these as human figures in the shadow, then we know there are other people around this child. And that Pat also added, we're closer to the figure in this photo than in Chapman. So that also adds to that sense of intimacy. And when Yehuda said the cat on the hat, I also thought this may actually be a working cat, that cats, or my cats, are kept for affection and being spoiled, and so that there's somebody to tell us what to do in our household. But cats, in this instance, might actually be doing the important work of keeping rodents of any sort out of either your food or your animals' food, right? Barn cats continue to be important figures in places where people have barns with feed in them. I'm going to pop us to the next image, which I have seductively put up, not with the caption. I'll show you the caption in a moment, but I want us to start just by doing a close reading of this photograph. Spend a moment with it. Think about what you notice right away, and think about what you notice only after you've looked at it for a while, and just be with it in a moment before we start analyzing it. And I will say, I actually had 3 questions written down. What do you notice right away? What do you notice only after you've looked at it for a while? And what does the photo make you feel? But 2 people had immediately written love in the chat. I was like, okay, makes everybody feel loved, or feel an expression of love outward. So what did you notice right away? What did you only notice after you had looked at it for a little bit?
Chuck Barnes, what do you think?
Well, right away, the first thing I saw was the hat and the camera. So these 2 sort of icons. One is the sort of cowboy icon of the hat, and the camera. And then what I notice as I sort of sit with it longer is, I don't know whether cow people wore those kind of things on their wrists as sort of a cowboy thing, but they seem to me something that I associate more with you know, motorbikers or something, you know, the leather gear, although this might be sort of cowboy gear. The other thing I noticed after looking at it for a bit is, like the last picture, there's no face. You just see the hat. You see a human figure facing me, looking at me through the camera, but I can't really see the person other than the clothes that they have in their hands.
Like, I didn't even realize that I had picked 3 images in a row in which we can't see faces. It's hard not to do that with John Chapman's work, but I didn't realize I'd done that with the other pictures as well. So yeah, so it's interesting, the wanting to read what's authentic or not authentic. A number of people have noticed the triangle of the legs, which is really interesting. Like, what do we want to say about the significance or the effect of the triangle of the legs? And then somebody said they noticed that the way the tree echoes the hat shape.
Sandy Polishuk, what do you think?
Well, I was just writing it. I noticed that he's lined up with the tree behind him. I mean, well, the first thing I noticed was you couldn't see his face. The legs open to me seemed like a cowboy, right? I mean, they're bow-legged from sitting on horses. The next, and so the second thing I noticed was the tree, that he was in line with that tree. When eventually I noticed the various extraneous things. Something's hanging on the fence on the left. There's that skull up above the gate or fence. And then there's something on the ground, something white. It even could be a book, but that would be quite inconsistent. Behind him, actually, his leg is blocking a little bit of it.
Yeah,
and then of course, all 3 pictures, all 3 have had shadows.
Thank you. And Kristen observed, as everybody was talking about the triangle of his legs, it's also the stance of a cowboy about to shoot, but not a gun, a camera. And it looks like Marvin has a metaphorical hand raised. So is Marvin up next?
Okay, the camera, first of all, I noticed the camera. It stands out, not only because it stands out, because my mother had a camera like that, the kind that opens with the bellows when you open the front of the camera. The other thing is that he's not wearing working clothes. I assume it's a he. He's dressed up. He's wearing fancy clothes.
Can you tell us how you know that they are fancy?
Well, the cuffs are, first of all, the working cuffs would normally be just ordinary leather. And there's something about the chaps that look too tailored to me. When I see the figure, I see someone who is not dressed to work, someone who's dressed up. The overall impression of it, I don't know how to explain it better than that.
I think also the whiteness of that shirt, whatever you're doing in this outside environment, I don't think a white shirt is your best choice if you are in a strictly, if it's your everyday workaday attire. But was there more that you were going to say, Marvin, or was that?
I might have.
Okay.
After him, I'm wondering if Kathy Birch wanted to say anything. I saw there was a reaction that went up.
Marvin alluded to this. I was looking at the photographer's hands and trying to decide, since apparently this woman whose name we learned on the previous picture lived in Wyoming and it was a family, I guess this is a young man's hands, but it could be a woman. I'm not sure. I mean, I first took it as a guy, but since she took photographs, well, maybe it's a self-portrait.
I'll get it. And I will say that in general, we've a fair number of new folks here. And you will, if you continue to join us, as I hope you will, know that I'm usually not much one for trying to take what we know about the photographer to read the photograph. I'm more interested in us kind of responding to what we see in the images, and also being careful that we're not creating narratives that we don't know are true about the images. So I try and ask those questions in terms of what we notice and what effect it has. I do want to come back to a few of the comments people have made in the chat. Pat said, the camera is really central in this picture. It is maybe not exactly the center point, but it is very close to the center, and it's pointed at the viewer. And then Yehuda said, yes, it's dueling cameras, right? It's not, let's have a cowboys dueling in the corral, but the dueling cameras between the person we see and the camera that is not pictured, but is implied in what's going, in the fact that there is a photograph here. And Pat has said, dying to know the vintage of this photo could be fairly recent. And John said, an irony associated with the cowboy photographing us, the West looking back at us. And there is a reason that Lois slyly did not put the caption on the first version, right? So this is Skyline Rodeo, Ted Higbee. We now know the figure has a name, and we see Ted Higbee in other pictures in the exhibition, though we won't be looking at them tonight. And I have to tell you, I would not have recognized Ted Higbee from one photo to the next. So we know that it's the rodeo, which fits with what we were saying about the dressed upness. But I am very interested in the 1928-ness, as it were, of this photo from 1928. It surprised me. And I think it surprised me because I felt like this photo is loaded with the tropes of the West that we know from Hollywood. The cowboy hat and the chaps and the stance, and even the camera standing in for the gun in the shootout in the corral, all feels very Hollywood to me. But if this image is from 1928, what is that? It's not a response to or a play on the Hollywood image, because it is really before, or at least at the very beginning of that genre. So what do you make of the, does seeing the caption or the date change your reading of the photograph? And Pat is also correcting my film history and saying there were Western films before 1928, although I think of the eruption of the West in popular culture as somewhat more of a post-World War II. I might be wrong. Does knowing it is from 1928, does knowing it's a rodeo photo change your reading of it or your response to it in any way? I see a Molly and a Marvin.
Well, I just wanted to make a comment about this in relation to Johnnie Chapman's work and the notion of dress, and how the clues in this photograph ground us in a time and a place. And whereas Johnnie Chapman was, in terms of costume, was kind of going back to that sort of timelessness. And so I think it's an interesting compare and contrast to the role that dress plays or accoutrements to establish a sense, a place in time. So I know that didn't answer your question, but that was something that I noticed.
If I start by saying there are no right answers, I have to appreciate all answers. Marvin, what did you have to add?
Well, I'm pleased that we know it was a dress up. It was almost a costume because he's dressed up for rodeo. But I keep focusing on the fact that the fence is handmade. It's not a manufactured fence. There are no manufactured posts or rails. I don't know if that necessarily means anything, but as we keep talking about, that stands out to me that this is a very country primitive setting, really.
Although there's the camera in the picture, there's the camera taking the picture, which also tells us not just cameras, but film, right? Camera is a one-time expense. You can get that from your Sears Roebuck catalog, but you're going to keep needing to be able to access film to be taking the pictures. But I think you're right about those not being those being hand-made posts that were in an interesting moment here. And Kathy has reminded us, the reason we have rodeos is that it was actually a way that working cowboys showed off their working cowboy skills. So we think of them now as sort of a dress-up play, but that's not the way that they originally existed. Can I move us to the next picture? Because I'm totally excited to keep looking at more photos. Is that okay? Nobody's...
Daryl unmuted himself. Daryl, did you want to chime in on this picture?
Yeah, I was just going to say that this is really beginning the height of tourism, car tourism, auto tourism. The West was very fertile territory. A lot of Kodak ads featured lots and lots of sort of Western activities. This would fit right in with that. Again, sensation to, get your picture made at a real Western rodeo by a real cowboy. So, the camera size I noticed was a little bit larger than what would easily fit in a pocket, though they might have actually called it a pocket photo camera, but it's probably closer to the postcard size, which would immediately been contact printed, made to a postcard, and been available to send back to your friends to show your travels.
Oh, nice. I like that. And I didn't realize that in 1928 there was already good Western tourism. Oh, okay. So let's move back to Johnnie Chapman. Is this photograph doing something different than the earlier Johnnie Chapman image at the Grand Canyon? Is it doing something different than the Lora Webb Nichols images? And what are the cultural references here? So maybe start with just that first question of how does this photograph compare to the first photograph we looked at of Johnnie at the Grand Canyon?
Hey, Daryl, what do you think?
Well, rhyolite already comes to mind. It's a part of an early essay about photographs of the West. Mark Klett was a part of that. Rhyolite is a ghost town. Salton Sea is another one of those destinations lots of people have photographed, but it's sort of ripe with rephotography's own history. That was like a massive bullet point as soon as I saw the title, Rhyolite.
And a couple of comments about the ruins dwarfing the teeny figure, that the ruins are, the human-made ruins are what's foregrounded here as opposed to just the landscape. Is Chuck up next?
Yes, go ahead, Chuck.
Yeah, I mean, this makes me think of 19th century landscape painting of ruins, like Frederick Edwin Church. There's a painting of his called Syria by the Sea, which is basically like a view through ruins, but these are not like imaginary Greek or Roman ruins. They're from much later than that. You can see the rebar coming out of the concrete. It's not really like, it's not stone.
Yeah, so there's a European tradition that of course begins not with photography, but with painting, that starts in the 18th century about going to visit the ruins of the great civilizations, i.e. Greece and Rome, because we know all great things have to involve white people. And that this is now being transposed to the American West, but in a really different way, because as you said, they're modern ruins. We can see the rebar, and Brianna has added in the chat, the Salton Sea is a human-created lake that is now a human-created ecological disaster, right? So it is an acceleration of ruination. And I guess I wonder, when thinking about Brianna's comment, does that mean that, is there a critique that we think we're getting in this photograph about humans in the West? And Michael may have answered that question in part by saying, yes, it makes me think of nuclear tests in the desert. Michael, could you say more about what the effect is of that association on you as a viewer?
It just feels kind of apocalyptic to me, like maybe science fiction. It's foreboding and mysterious.
Yeah, I love that you say science fiction because it makes me think about Star Trek as often shot in the scenes of the American West, right?
Mhm.
And there's a weird, we don't have a sense that this is the last remaining part of a civilization that has been there. It feels a little, to me, plunked down in a landscape.
Yeah, like somebody came in a spaceship and built a city and then it didn't work out too well.
So again, is this doing something different than Chapman's earlier image? If his project is the self-portrait as silhouette in the American West, what do we think about the differences or similarities across the two photographs?
There's three different things here. Some of his other ones, there's two things. There's him and the landscape. But here you have this ruin also. It's a whole different conversation.
Ralph, Ralph, what do you think?
Yeah, I'll just follow up on that that thought. Is that how I read it is that for the artist, for the photographer, standing in front of the Grand Canyon is overwhelming, but in a sense, the image of himself in the face of nature is much more confident, I think. And the relationship between his image and the land is a little different than this, which is the relationship of him to not nature, but man's use and building on nature. It seems to me that the significance of the cultural ruins, the relationship between he and the cultural ruins are much different than the relationship between he and the natural world.
Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking if I had to sum up the first photograph in one word, it would be grandeur. And grandeur is definitely not what we're seeing here, even though there is an expansive landscape that we are seeing. The ruin is occupying much more of the photo, and his physical relationship to it. I mean, he's framed by ruin, which is a fascinating way to create a self-portrait.
Yeah, but it looks more like he's there trying to figure out what's going on with the landscape and the ruin. So it almost makes him much less important in the whole scheme of it.
And I think Steve put in the chat, the interest here is between the viewer and the human figure. In the first photo, the viewer and the figure are looking at the same thing. So we're looking at somebody looking out, but there's not a sort of foreground between us and that figure. And here, that ruin it's a foreground, so it's sort of mediating our relationship to the figure in a particular way. He could have set this photo up so that we saw the figure looking at the ruin with the landscape beyond, and it would have a really different feel, I think. John has asked a question, and if they are not in the same place, that was the title that I stole off of the photo list from Blue Sky. So I don't know the answer to that. And Brianna's pointing out that the figure, as with the first photo, is still in the center and still voided, meaning appears almost as a silhouette in the image.
Let's see, Daryl, did you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, again, we have that sense of scale provided by the figure. That's sort of almost a go-to technique to establish size. And in this case, it conflates. No, that's the wrong word. It exaggerates this sort of ruin as being this really monumental. I mean, there's at least 3 stories available with these windows, so it wasn't a small building at the time, but it's towering because of the composition. And then the window, which of course is one of those other photography favorites of characters through windows and doorways. So it really fits really neatly and nicely, even poetically, into sort of commenting on photography's place in history as both, you know, sort of a visual construct, and again for the West, you know, ruins, which is what Mark Klett was originally interested in Rhyolite, was, you know, these portraits of failure. But we sort of look at them, and it's the opposite of the picturesque. It's the unpicturesque, yet it's done in picturesque style. So there's a wonderful irony that works in this photograph.
And again, like there's the West and there's Western culture, to come back to the comment I think that Chuck started us off with, and somebody else had put in the chat about Greek and Roman ruins, which is this notion of Western Europe as the Western culture that white America wants to affiliate itself with. Do we want to take time to talk about one more photo? I actually want to take more time to talk about 800 more photos that I have in the slideshow. But here's another Johnnie Chapman image. I'm hoping this one really is the Salton Sea and that I haven't erroneously titled two of the photos. What is going on here? What, if we talked about some of the cultural reference in the last image, what are the cultural reference here? And how is this going? So Pat has said, wow, like prison, which is really interesting, where Johnnie has placed his own figure behind the bars there. Other thoughts on the reference here, or other things about this photo?
Daryl, what do you think?
Well, the era depression, the WPA photographers that would ultimately, you know, photograph, and I think it might have been Borquite, who photographed Americans standing in line for bread, for food, in front of a huge billboard that was touting the American dream, the American life. And it's just the bittersweetness of this desolate landscape, this wall separating us from nothing. And then, you know, as you've already spoken to, the prison-like and then the black figure. This is about as thick as you can get, and as simple, really incredibly well executed in its directness. But the historical references this pulls up are enormous.
But like American Dreams Real Estate, our Uncle Bob has definitely listed this, I think, free of irony as a possibility. So I want to hear from Chuck and then Sandy, I think.
I think there's a lot of things about here that are fascinating. So first of all, this American Dreams, there are places like this out in the desert in California and other places where you can just buy land really cheaply and sort of have your dream in the middle of nothing, where there's no water, but people just do it. But here, this sort of this Marist idea of it is one wall. Like if you look through the gate, the wall looks like it doesn't extend very far back. It's just up against whatever the road is. And you get the idea that this is this marker of someone's ownership of some piece of dirt, but it's kind of pathetic because there's really nothing there except dirt. But yet it's for sale. There's always this sort of American hope that through buying and selling something, you know, something good's someone's gonna make something of that someday, which looks ridiculous at the same time as that there's some, you know, piece of hope in it that's simultaneous with it. I don't know. I love it.
And your opinion is one trade in the architectural arts. This is not a ruin, right? To me, this looks brand spanking new. Sandy's nodding her head. So Sandy, why don't you tell us what you were thinking?
Yeah, I'm struck by the travesty of this wall in this previously unspoiled spot other than a road. And also the reference to the travesty of prisons together. And the closing up, the putting up walls, spoiling of that area.
Yeah, I mean,
I agree with Chuck, yeah.
the idea that I have built literally only one wall of something, but I still feel the need to have a barred gate across it, right? Like we can't look at land without implying keeping people out, without implying I have something precious that I want to be sure you can't access. Yet, as people are pointing out, like there's also this incredible irony between Seawind Avenue and what we actually are observing about the kind of dryness and rockiness of the soil in the foreground. Ralph, what were you going to add?
To me, I don't know if the travesty is built into this image. I think there is an absurdity and a surrealness to the fact that on the other side of this gate is property, and that's what it's selling, property. And Salton Sea is that area is not a pretty piece of nature. It is nature, but it's, you know, there isn't anything worth. It's kind of valueless, which is why people went there in the first place, to maybe make an oasis. But anyway, what I find is when an artist injects himself into his photo, and we know his history, is that image, that silhouette, is not a man on the other side of a gate, but a man on the other side of bars. And his injection, or his presence, putting himself in his own image, changes the way that what that means. And I think that then the resonation of American Dreams and all that resonates differently. It becomes a different kind of song with different kinds of instruments. I think metaphorically, this one is just really powerful because you look at it differently, and that's the same thing differently. So thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate the way you phrase that. You know, if we think about an American dream that is a dream of domination, and you recall the American Progress image from 1872 that I showed at the very beginning of this session, Western progress, it was predicated on two things. One was dispossessing natives of land, but the other was that land was going to be cultivated often largely through the expansion of labor of enslaved Black people. That in fact, if you think about where Native Americans were displaced from on the East Coast originally, they experienced a second displacement as the expansion of cotton of cotton growing in the US and the cotton market sort of works hand in hand. And so thinking about what Western expansion means for Black people as well as Native Americans, and how that fits into a much more disturbing American dream than we're taught to associate with the words American dream. And that the American dream of real estate in the 20th century is so shaped by things like redlining, which makes purchasing real estate very valuable for predominantly white families as a way to build generational wealth, and closes out those who are redlined from that same kind of acquisition of generational wealth. Is there more to say about this photo? Oh, Brianna's got a hand up.
Hi, I just wanted to add all of that, the idea about redlining, and I think his putting his body behind the bars is very intentional in the American dreams. But the Salton Sea my point was that it's a ecological disaster, because I think what happened here is that the Colorado River was redirected to make a lake in a place where there shouldn't have been one, and then it escaped and all the water went away. And so all these, it was meant to be this beautiful resort town. So that's why it's called Seawind Avenue. And there probably was a lot of real estate on it, and all the real estate is now valueless, and they're trying to farm and do things like that. But the all of the garbage that runs off from the agricultural sites around there comes in to this empty lake bed that's continually receding, and it's making these toxic dust storms. So it started out as this American dream, like this picture can be read on that level, like it was an American dream, come and be at this beautiful lakeside resort, whatever it was. But then because of ecological disaster, piled on ecological disaster, then it becomes this wasteland, which is literally toxic and dangerous for people to live there, which I think, you know, he knows that, I think, going into this picture. I think he's trying to do something else with this image, but like that's also part of it, is that the American West has been, you know, we're hurting it by our presence there. And then perhaps you could even layer onto that, like what are humans doing to other humans, like in you know, like nature, hurting nature, and then man behind bars and other people who, you know, inhabit this space with us. How do we treat them? Maybe that's going a little bit far, but Salton Sea is its own very special, gorgeous, but horrible place.
I will say, in terms of going so far, like when we're talking about what these photos evoke in us, I think we get a fair bit of range to think about it. I feel a little bit bad not like sending this out from this photo. Amanda, will you tell me, do you think I can squeeze in one more?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. We're back to Lora, Webb, Nichols, or really to Winters and McCarthy. So is this a Western photo? And if yes, how so? If not, why not? And Pat has already said manspreading. I'm pretty sure that word was not in Lora Webb Nichols' mind when she took this photo, but I see what you're on about. Is this a Western photo? I can't have stumped you all. We've talked so much.
I'm wondering if Kathy Birch wants to start us off.
Is it a Western photo? Why not? I mean, the way you ask the question implies that there would be a reason to think not. I mean, it looks like a bar. It looks like a bar I've been to in Louisville, Colorado. The Coca-Cola sign, you know, a couple of guys. They may or may not be old enough to be there, but, you know.
There may or may not have been rules about that.
And the grayer I get, the younger they get. That's all I can say about that.
Right. I think we have this notion of the saloon as part of the Western landscape, which again probably comes as much from Hollywood as from reality, although certainly the West, like anywhere, is littered with bars. And Pat is cheating and saying, well, we know that Nichols worked in the West. But thinking about, Brianna has pulled out, you know, that's a pair of pressed trousers. Look, especially on the left, at how well creased those trousers are. And then Pat says, oh yeah, and let's look at the boots. Marvin has said the riding pants. Certainly these are not homespun clothes, right? This is manufactured clothing kept in a particular way. That Coca-Cola is a brand name that tells us that there's already a kind of corporate domination that's happening across the American landscape. Any other comments on this one? Kathy, yeah.
I always wonder, in the blouses that women wore in a similar era, I mean, people had amazing clothes. People were really serious about their clothing. And those irons just look like a pain in the wrist to me, but people used them.
You mean,
I don't think pressed pants make it not legit.
Right, but there is labor implied in the clothing.
Sure.
And I have to say, we spent a long time in the gallery standing in front of this particular photo and trying to decide whether that was exactly the same shirt or two different shirts that just happened to look alike, right? And that's also about like, where are you getting your clothing? If you're in a fairly remote community, how many different pairs of whatever are there, or is this all being bought via catalog? Chuck Barnes, do you have a hand up?
I guess I'd also say, like, the narrative that I find myself kind of concocting about this is these are maybe, they sort of vague, there's something vaguely uniformy about the clothes. The fact that the shirts appear to be almost identical, right? There's something about the way that their shirts are tucked in and their belts makes it look like they're like, it's not really a military uniform, it seems like, but are they like part of some work crew that requires some work? It somehow, there's more, just because I've seen the other pictures in this exhibit, the others are sort of, you know, the outdoor pictures and it's sort of more rough hewn, and this seems like these guys are from some organized group that is in town for some time. Now that's an imagined narrative. There's no, I have no evidence to support that.
I will have you know that you have been confirmed by various folks in the chat talking about this is the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which is a New Deal program, if this is 1933. And if you've seen the work in the gallery or online, there are other CCC photos. So it's not definitive from this photo that these are CCC workers, but it's almost certainly the case based on what else we know is going on in the 1933. So your idea of government issue, it seems to fit with that. Any other thoughts on this one?
Ralph, what do you think?
Yeah, a photo like this can be put to use in a lot of narratives, and this could also be put to use in as other photographs have been, as part of gay theory, part of, and the closeness and the physical contact, and what this means. Is it hidden or is it private, or are these just friends? So I don't find enough information in the photograph to be specific, but I certainly find it interesting in many ways, probably unintended from the initial photograph. But this can, for me, move in a lot of different kind of ways. It isn't really grounded in anything specific, and the Westernness of it, you know, I don't know if there's any compass in there. I just don't know.
Yeah, I think I'm with you there. I feel the desire to read desire in this photograph, and in other of her photographs of either men together or of women together, a real desire to read desire in those photographs. So we are almost at 6:30, and I feel like I just want to show two more photos because we're not going to get to talk about them, but there was a point this morning as I was putting these together where I thought, oh, I have also managed to not put in any photographs with female figures. How did I get there? So I will just put this one in and say, this is a fantastic photo, and I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to talk about this particular one. It's an interesting question about whether anybody noticed that we had come this far without seeing any female subjects. Does gender really matter in some profound way? Do cats matter? Thank you, Pat, for noticing. I do feel like there is a little bit of circularity to come back to the cat. And also, I'm pretty sure that's a crutch that she is leaning on. And I would be interested if we had more time in talking about disability. And is this a photo that is about disability? Because that is also a history that I think more people are paying attention to excavating now, is the documentation of living with disability in America. So I'll leave you with this one, and then, because I can't help it, we inhabit the wet West, and all of the images of the West that we saw were really the dry West, but I also wanted us to remember the wet West before we go. So with these two amazing photos, I'll just leave it on the cat. Thank you all for another wonderful Salon from Anywhere. And as I said, we are doing this again May 26th. I don't know yet what the work will be. I have to wait and see what goes up in the gallery. And again on June 23rd, when we're going to be looking at America's highways, and I think thinking about the West. The highways are not always in the West, as you know, they are everywhere in America, but how that fits in with our expansionist notion. And remind us, somebody from Blue Sky, somebody asked, how much longer are the shows up? So which one?
Lora Webb Nichols show, this closes on Saturday, this Saturday. So tomorrow, Friday, and Saturday are going to be your days to come see it in person, noon to 5.
In your mask, of course.
And with your mask, of course, and the new county guidelines, capacity is 6, but we're allowing walk-ins as long as our capacity stays good like that. And Johnnie Chapman show will be up through May.
Great. All right. Well, thank you all. I hope that we have indeed turned some notions of the West upside down and that we won't fall off the globe as a result.
Thanks, Lois.